Jimin and Jungkook have just arrived in Toronto, but it wasn't their arrival at Rogers Stadium that immediately sent fans into a frenzy. It was what happened just seconds after they left the airport. Amid a swarm of cameras, the two were seen walking side by side, briefly holding hands, while Jungkook carried Jimin's suitcase. The brief moment immediately raised one big question. What actually happened between them during their journey to Toronto that made Jungkook appear so attentive toward Jimin? Welcome to Jimin Gallery, the home for Park Jimin fans who want to discover all the latest news, interesting facts, and stories behind the world's spotlight on Jimin. Jimin and Jungkook's arrival in Toronto, Canada, for their schedule at Rogers Stadium immediately became the center of attention. As soon as the plane carrying the two landed, the atmosphere at the airport seemed to transform into a sea of cameras. Fans and members of the media waited for their every move, while camera flashes continued to go off from every direction. However, behind all the excitement was a much simpler and more emotional travel story than what appeared in front of the lenses. During their flight to Toronto, Jimin and Jungkook were said to have traveled calmly despite their busy schedules. Far away from the glare of cameras, the two spent their journey without much attention. No one expected that after spending hours in the air, a small moment in the airport corridor would become such a major point of interest. When the exit doors finally opened, everyone's attention immediately turned toward the two figures walking side by side. Jimin appeared alongside Jungkook, walking calmly, but then something happened that instantly caused the atmosphere to become lively. The two were seen walking hand in hand as they left the airport area. Amid the crowd and flashing cameras, the simple gesture immediately sparked various reactions from the fans watching their arrival. The moment felt even more dramatic because it happened spontaneously, without a stage or any special preparation. However, it was not only their hand-holding that caught people's attention. Jungkook was also seen carrying Jimin's suitcase while Jimin walked beside him. The sight touched many fans while also making them curious. Jungkook's seemingly thoughtful behavior appeared to reveal another side of their relationship when they were away from stage and the spotlight. Amid the chaos of the airport, that small act of consideration seemed even more meaningful than the bright camera flashes. The reason that was later widely discussed was that Jungkook reportedly wanted Jimin to avoid becoming too tired from carrying his suitcase. The simple sentiment of not wanting Jimin to get tired made the moment feel even sweeter to fans. For some people, carrying a suitcase may not seem like anything special, but after a long journey, following a flight, and in the middle of a busy schedule, the small action appeared to be a spontaneous expression of care. The cameras pointed toward them seemed to capture a different kind of story. There was no big stage, no choreography, and no performance lighting. There were simply Jimin and Jungkook walking out of the airport toward their vehicle, with Jungkook carrying one suitcase, and their hands briefly intertwined. Perhaps because of its simplicity, the moment felt so dramatic and made it difficult for fans to look away. Now, their arrival in Toronto is not simply about their journey to Rogers Stadium, but also about one small moment that managed to steal attention amid the chaos of the airport. From their long journey inside the airplane cabin to the moment they stepped out in front of the cameras, Jimin and Jungkook once again showed that care can sometimes appear in the simplest forms. Staying by someone's side, holding their hand, and carrying their suitcase when the person beside them is already tired. Behind the flashing cameras, it was precisely this simple moment that made their arrival in Toronto so memorable. Jimin and Jungkook's journey to Toronto, Canada, seemed to be just as interesting as their arrival at Rogers Stadium. Before the airplane doors closed and the engines began carrying them away from their departure point, the atmosphere was naturally filled with the usual activity of a long-distance journey. Passengers making sure they had all their belongings, cabin crew preparing for the flight, and the atmosphere gradually changing as the aircraft prepared for takeoff. Amid all of this, Jimin and Jungkook chose to make the journey calmly, far away from the commotion of the cameras that usually follow their every step. As the plane took off, the roar of the engines gradually became the background sound accompanying their journey. Imagine how the atmosphere that had previously been filled with activity became quieter once the plane reached cruising altitude. Jimin and Jungkook then entered a more peaceful phase of their journey before facing the spotlight again upon arriving in Toronto. No one truly knows what happened during the flight, but that very uncertainty left fans wondering, what did they talk about before the plane finally landed? Time passed until the cabin crew's announcement could be heard, signaling that the journey to Toronto was coming to an end. Passengers gradually began preparing themselves, checking their belongings and waiting for the aircraft to reach the runway. Through the windows, the view of Toronto began appearing in the distance. What had initially felt like an ordinary moment suddenly became a new anticipation, because once the airplane doors opened, Jimin and Jungkook would once again face a world that had been waiting for their arrival. When the plane's wheels finally touched the runway, the long journey officially entered a new chapter. The aircraft slowly made its way toward the parking area while passengers began preparing to disembark. Outside, the atmosphere was just as busy. Cameras were already waiting, fans were trying to find the best positions, and attention gradually focused on one question. When would Jimin and Jungkook be seen? The airplane doors finally opened. One by one, passengers began making their way out, but the atmosphere felt different as the two highly anticipated stars began approaching. Camera flashes seemed to signal that the long-awaited moment had finally arrived. Jimin and Jungkook were then seen walking together, entering the airport with seemingly calm steps amid increasingly intense attention. But who would have expected that just seconds after they appeared, attention would instead turn toward a simple gesture? Jimin and Jungkook were seen walking side by side while holding hands, while Jungkook also appeared to be carrying Jimin's suitcase. Amid the flashing cameras, the simple action immediately stood out. If their arrival alone had already caused excitement among fans, the sight only made people even more curious. Was there a particular story behind their long journey before they finally left the airport? And perhaps that is the most interesting part of their arrival in Toronto. After a long journey that took place far from the public eye, the cameras only managed to capture a few seconds when they finally left the airport. Jungkook carried Jimin's suitcase. The two walked side by side, and their hands were briefly intertwined. Was it simply an act of consideration after a long journey? Or was there another moment during the flight that was never captured by the cameras? One thing is certain. Before they continued on to Rogers Stadium, those few seconds at the airport were already enough to make fans wonder what had actually happened behind scenes. As soon as Jimin and Jungkook began to appear in the distance, the atmosphere around the airport instantly changed. Fans' cheers echoed through the area, while phones and cameras were immediately raised to capture their arrival. Some fans even appeared to be searching for openings through the crowd so they could get a clearer view of the two. Within seconds, an area that had previously been relatively calm transformed into a sea of cameras and cheers. Amid the noisy welcome, Jimin was seen walking alongside Jungkook after their long journey to Toronto. His movements appeared calm, and he did not make many gestures toward the cameras, as though he simply wanted to get through the crowd and continue their journey. Fans' attention remained focused on him, especially when Jungkook walked beside him and appeared to show care as they made their way toward the exit. However, attention peaked once again when Jungkook was seen carrying Jimin's suitcase. The moment happened naturally amid the constant flashes of cameras. There was no stage, no music, just two people who had arrived after a long journey. For fans watching from a distance, that small action seemed particularly meaningful, especially as Jimin appeared to choose a calmer pace while Jungkook took over carrying the suitcase. Amid the screams and cameras following them, the two eventually left the airport area. The moment left fans with many questions. What was the atmosphere like between them inside the plane? When exactly did Jungkook decide to carry Jimin's suitcase? And what made the two appear so close as they left the airport? The cameras may have captured only a few seconds, but for fans, those few seconds were enough to become an entire story before the two continued their journey toward Rogers Stadium. What made the atmosphere even more exciting was not simply the fact that Jimin and Jungkook had finally arrived in Toronto, but a simple gesture captured by the cameras. As they walked out of the airport area, the two were briefly seen holding hands. Within seconds, the cameras already pointed toward them seemed to capture a completely unexpected moment. Fans immediately paid close attention to their every step, trying to capture those brief seconds from different angles. The hand-holding itself does not necessarily need to be interpreted beyond what was visibly shown. Amid the crowded surroundings, the gesture became one of the most attention-grabbing moments because it happened spontaneously in front of numerous cameras. For fans, even a single second can become something incredibly precious, especially after a long journey that had made their arrival in Toronto highly anticipated from the very beginning. However, there was another side of the moment that was equally interesting. Amid the camera flashes and fans' cheers, Jungkook was seen carrying Jimin's suitcase. The attention that initially focused on their hand-holding gradually shifted toward this simple action. No grand words could be clearly heard amid the crowd, but seeing Jungkook help carry the suitcase made the moment between them feel warmer and more human. In front of the cameras, Jimin and Jungkook are known as two major stars whose every move can attract public attention. Yet behind the spotlight, what was captured were simple things. Walking side by side, keeping each other away from the crowd, holding hands, and helping carry belongings. It was precisely the contrast between the glamorous life of being stars and the simplicity of their gestures that made the airport moment feel so powerful. In the end, the cameras could only record what happened within those few seconds, while the complete story behind the moment remains unknown to the public. Did they hold hands because of the crowded situation, or was it simply a spontaneous gesture after a long journey? And when exactly did Jungkook decide to carry Jimin's suitcase? These are the questions that have kept their arrival in Toronto at the center of attention, even after the two left the airport and continued on to their next schedule at Rogers Stadium.